we're talking about the question of humanity, what it is to be human, what it means if I call myself a secular humanist. Every time we say the title of our show, Benjamin wants to interrogate it. And so we thought we should have an episode where we did that. And
that's because Benjamin is a Jew. That's no, I'm not necessarily contrasting that with secular humanists. I'm just saying that's at least culturally.
Yes. Okay. So you're saying because you're a Jew, you want to
interrogate anything. I mean,
I
don't know if you could pick a title that I would not constantly want to interrogate.
No. Yeah. All right. So, and I admit I have some tendencies in that direction myself. I did my undergrad at the University of Chicago, and they were very into teaching us to question everything, poke at everything. I try to instill that in my students now to more or less success. So, well, okay, do you have like if I asked you to define what it is to be human, do you want to take a stab at it?
Well, that's it. Sure, I'd be willing to talk about that. I also there are two pieces of this. One is human and the other is humanist. And one thing I really want to know is what you mean by humanist. But we could start with human if you want.
Yeah, I can do humanist. Humanist, I suppose to give some context, I was born in Sri Lanka, raised in Connecticut. I came to the U.S. when I was 2.5, and my family is Catholic. So Sri Lanka went through 3 waves of colonization by Europeans, waves earlier by Sinhalese and Tamils coming down from India, but that was 2,000 years ago. So we'll jump ahead to the Europeans in the middle of the last century, and there were the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the English, and the British. And the Portuguese in particular, one of the things that they did was they built a lot of Catholic schools, and it was clear that if you wanted to do well in the colonial administration as a native, it would be to your advantage to be Catholic, right? So at some point, and I don't know where exactly that happened, one of my great-grandparents decided, for probably the sake of his family's and his kids' future, to convert from Hinduism to Catholicism. And it took, I would say, my family was very devout. So growing up, at least my mother was very devout. My dad always went to church, but my mother was sort of like more strongly so, in the sense of when I started running around with white boys, she would threaten to go to this big church in Canada and climb up the steps on her knees so that God would grant, there are many, many steps at this church. It's a famous church. I'm forgetting the name of it. So that if she got to the top, God would grant her a wish, not a wish, but
a boon or something.
A boon, a favor, I don't know, a blessing to stop her daughter from ruining her life, right? So
I wonder what the mechanism of that would have been. Like, how would God have gone about that?
I assume that he would have intervened in my heart and
that
I was breaking my mother's heart, right? So
so that was your grandmother who said that, or your
no, my mother.
It was your mother. Oh, okay.
Yeah, and we were really pretty hardcore Catholics. Like,
I mean, that's super Catholic.
Yeah,
climbing up the steps on your knees is like, that's the most Catholic story I've.
Yeah, she's never actually done it, so if she had, perhaps, but we also we used to road trip when I was a kid. We lived in Connecticut. My mom had one sister who had also come to the U.S. but was in Chicago. We couldn't really afford to fly the whole family to visit her, so I think once a year during the summer we would drive from Connecticut to Chicago, which is a long drive, and we always my family, and I think this is sort of common in the old world, like, you know how you get on a plane and your dad is like, call when you arrive so I know that the plane landed safely, right? So my family has always been like that. And before getting in the car and driving across a chunk of the country, we had to do a novena, right? So we had to kneel in my parents' bedroom the night before and do a novena to St. Anthony, I want to say, patron of lost travelers, perhaps. I'm sorry, it might be St. Christopher. I can't quite remember, one of those two, patron of something relevant, and
Right.
it was a hardcore novena is where you go through the rosary and you do all these prayers, call and response, the Our Father, the Hail Marys, and we had to like be on our knees. You couldn't like sink down onto your heels. You had to like be upright on your knees for, it was something like 3 hours. So
Wow! Holy
yeah,
crap! That's a lot of novena.
we were very Catholic. So that's, I guess I wanted to give this context. It's kind of a long story, but hopefully it gives a context of like, that's the religious tradition I grew up in. I went to a Catholic school, Holy Cross in New Britain, Connecticut. And until 7th grade, I would say I was a pretty default Catholic. I even at one point kind of flirted with the idea of becoming a nun. There was something about it that appealed to me. And
do you feel like that was, so this is a mostly Polish Catholic neighborhood, right? Not mostly Sri Lankan Catholic.
Neighborhood. Yeah. Oh no.
Do you feel like everybody was that hardcore? Were the Sri Lankan Catholics more hardcore, or were the Poles also doing 3-hour novenas at the bedside?
I don't know. I would guess that we were maybe a little more hardcore. Like the church in Sri Lanka, when we went to visit it, all the women covered their heads with a cloth, right?
Yep.
Which is kind of a more old world Catholic tradition. And I don't think that wasn't happening in our church in New Britain, right? So I would guess that some of those had fallen away. I think things like observing the no meat on Fridays thing, I would guess, I'd have to ask my parents, but I guess that was an every Friday thing in Sri Lanka, whereas in Connecticut it had slipped a little, right?
Yeah.
Maybe once a month the school has fish sticks on Friday, right? So instead of pizza. So I don't remember the specifics, but that would be my guess. So sorry, this is a long thing, but I think it's important context.
I think it's good.
And then what happened in 7th grade is I came across the problem of evil, right? And I don't know who's listening to this. It's sort of funny, when I started teaching at college, for a while, I think it took me a while to realize not everyone was familiar with the Bible and Catholic dogma, right? So there was this transition period where I was like, oh, I have to start explaining these things because there's no reason to assume my students know any of this, right?
Yeah.
And depending on the class, sometimes most of my class was raised Christian, and sometimes very few of them were. So one piece of it is that in Catholicism, God is supposed to be both all-knowing and all-powerful, right? And that then raises the problem of evil. How can a God who is all-knowing and all-powerful allow terrible things to happen to good people, to innocent babies, et cetera, et cetera?
It's really omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, choose two.
Right. Yeah. Right. So yes, God is good. How can God be good and still do this? And I have to say, like, the nuns and the secular teachers didn't have a good answer for me, which now looking back, I would be like, oh, if I'd been in a hardcore Jesuit school,
right,
maybe they could have argued me to a position I could buy into.
Or at least it would have been an interesting argument.
Perhaps, but they didn't really, my teachers were not quite set up for that at that point, and many of them were, not all of them, but many of them were a little more in the just go to church kind of mode, right? This isn't your job to question this stuff at age 12. And then I had one teacher, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting her name. She was my biology teacher, and I hope she doesn't feel bad about this if she ever hears this, but she and I finally had a pretty frank conversation about this. And I was like, well, what if I'd been raised Hindu? What if I'd been raised Buddhist? Wouldn't I just believe whatever the people around me believed? And she was like, yes, probably. And I was like, why should I believe in Catholicism, especially when it has all of these problems that you can't give me a good answer to? Free will, blah, and I found the whole free will thing very unconvincing as a response to this.
As a response to theodicy.
As a response to the problem of evil. And she was like, well, you're probably right. And I was like, okay, I'm leaving the church. So at 12, I, in my head, split with the church. My parents would not let me stop going to church. So I still went every Sunday for a while. I was.
But you told your parents, and what was their reaction? Were they like, oh my God, this is terrible? Or were they just like, I don't, whatever, just go to church?
more the latter.
Huh,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah.
And then it was more, you are going to church and
You are going to church. Well, what
working your right. So,
did they do you think that's because they thought that your opinion on the matter wasn't that important as long as you perform the rituals? Or do you think that they thought, well, she's 12, she'll grow out of it? Or both?
maybe both,
Yeah.
right? I
Mhm.
think both. Keep in mind, I did want to be a nun at one point, so like,
Mhm.
I did grow out of some things there. My opinion shifted, so it's
Sure,
not
sure.
unreasonable of them to think
Yeah,
that.
not unreasonable.
But at 13 in the Catholic Church, you go through this process of confirmation. It's a sacrament. You are confirmed into the church, and this is supposed to be you with some measure of knowledge agreeing to this as
Mhm.
opposed to being baptized into the church as a baby, right?
Yeah.
So I really didn't want to be confirmed.
Mhm.
My parents were very insistent that I be confirmed and kind of upset. They were upset at the idea that I wouldn't be. So I did it. Uh, but you have to pick a saint to
Mhm.
be your confirmation saint.
Huh.
And the one that's the one you want to aspire to, and their name becomes part of your name, etc. And so I picked Kateria Tekakwitha, who is the first Native American saint,
Huh.
and I picked her because her origin story, like her superhero origin story, her
Yeah.
origin story was that she was just an interesting figure. Like she wore hair shirts and
Huh.
she
Yeah.
flogged herself
Uh-huh.
in attempts to become closer to God, but she also refused to marry the man her father chose for her because she considered herself a bride of Christ,
Mhm.
and got into a lot of trouble as a result. So that was my like, fine, you can make me be confirmed, but I
Mhm.
am now Marianne Amity Terry Tekakwitha Mohenraj, and I'm embedding rebellion into my
Yeah.
name.
Yeah.
So I don't know. So and I did basically. I had left the church. I didn't believe anymore. And in Catholicism, there's this thing called the leap of faith that
Mhm.
is supposed to be an inherent part of the doctrine that
Mhm.
you don't ask for proof. There's a whole parable about the apostle who wanted proof, and
Mhm.
Jesus like finally when Jesus comes back from the dead and Jesus lets him like put his fingers in the bleeding wounds from his time on the cross.
Mhm.
And Thomas is where we get the
Yeah.
phrase doubting
Doubting
Thomas,
Thomas.
right? So Thomas is like, okay, now I believe. And Jesus says, well, that's fine, but
That doesn't
you
count.
know, better to believe without needing proof,
Uh-huh.
right? And that, I
Yeah.
think, don't quote me on this, but I think that's essentially where the concept of the leap of faith comes from. That's what, as Catholics, you should aspire to, right? To make this leap of faith, believing in God, even though there's no evidence for it. Okay, so that's a whole lot of background. And flash forward to where I am now, which I would say briefly, I guess I believe in people. Um, and I'd call myself a strong agnostic in that I find the concept of a God in the framework of the Catholic God to be pretty unlikely. Um, but I, the universe, there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in your philosophy, right? And so it feels arrogant to say to be an atheist and
Mhm.
like a strong atheist in the sense of like, no, there can't be a God. I'm like, who knows, right? My
Mhm.
understanding of the universe is very limited by
Yeah.
my human capacity. So, um, that's okay. I don't know. Jump in and respond to any of that.
So I mean, well, no, that makes sense. I'm struck by this, and I was moved to ask about the humanism thing because I think you you at some point in one of these podcasts sort of offhandedly referred to us as secular humanists, like, well, after all, we should call it, or maybe even with regard to the title, like, well, we're secular humanists, and that's funny. That's one of these things where these gaps. Like, so my relationship with the term is very different, right? I don't think I would identify as a secular humanist. And it's interesting to think about why, like, because I don't think our belief system is necessarily that different. But for one thing, so taking those two words in turn, like, so the thing about secular is, in my experience, American Christians are very focused on the God thing. Like, whether you're a religious person in kind of a generalized American Christian context has to do with whether you believe in God. Um, that's not, in my world, that's not such a big thing. You know what I mean? Like I don't know. I mean, I would call myself religious, and I wouldn't call myself secular because I go to synagogue and
Mhm.
do stuff there. Like nobody's making me. I'm 50, and I mean, do whether I believe in God is like I don't know. That seems like it sometimes some days I would say yes. Some days I would be like it's a convenient metaphor. Some days I'd be like that's like asking do I believe in um you know, abstract art. Like, you know what I mean? Or like, I don't know.
Sure.
It is um, it's a story, right? But
Mhm.
I think of myself as a postmodern theist in the sense that I think that God is a made up story made up by people. But I also think that Benjamin Rosenbaum is a made up story, right? Like really, there's a
Mhm.
cloud of like there's a bunch of fields. There's a bunch like what we our best understanding is there's a bunch of like quantum potentials and fields. And if you kind of zoom out, they kind of cluster into wiggly things. Here at the border of my skin, there's like carbon and oxygen, and hydrogen bouncing off each other. And you can kind of say, well, this is a solid. And then you can say that this me, like this bunch of cells that's organized, was supposedly the same person as a little kid who was 7 who was made of entirely different atoms on the other side of the world 40 years ago, 43 years ago. I'm 50. You know what I mean? And sort of like I mean like clearly I'm on some level of fiction. You know what I
Sure.
mean?
No, so I understand that, but don't you think you're kind of conflating? I mean, yes, and we could segue from here into race as a construct and gender as a construct and so on, right? And I think
Well, that's
all
my
of
point is it's all
that.
stories, right? Stories all the way down. That's what I mean by postmodernist.
But I think I think the nuns that I went to school with would say there is a difference between that and the miraculous, the magical. Like this is where it kind of connects to science fiction and fantasy, right? Like that there is a fundamental distinction between a realist world and a world with a supernatural element.
But I mean,
Right?
is there though? Like the fact, like the thing, think about what I just said. There's these fields of atoms and quanta, and they think that they're a guy. Like I've carried the same stuffed animal with me since I was a little kid in Arlington, Virginia. Here I am in Basel, Switzerland, and I'm a collection of atoms, and it's a collection of atoms. And like I think it's a person in there, and I think I'm a person in here. And that's isn't that like a staggering I don't know, like really you can look at the you can look at this emerging from quarks and think that's not miraculous. I don't know. Anyway, I'm awestruck by wonder at the universe.
Really muddy use of miraculous. I mean, I don't buy that. Like you are a complex system. You are an incredibly complex system, but you are still a coherent system, right? And I can apply a set of rules to the construction of a Benjamin Rosenbaum that is essentially the same as the construction of a Marianne Monrage,
So
right?
I mean there's
Whereas
a
like the Catholic God can come by and be like, well, I'm going to blow all of that up because I feel like it. And now none of those systems mean anything anymore, right? And I'm going to construct a new system, or like it has that potential of, like it just doesn't matter anymore. Like it is a yeah. We're all only
so
here because of
so
God's way. So
I'm familiar with the Catholic God. I'm familiar with the thing you're talking about. I'm just saying that's not it's not particularly close to me culturally. There's no reason I should consider that particular hypothesis about the Catholic God to have any more. You know what I mean? Like I sure there's a million like you told your teacher in whatever grade. Humans have
sure,
come up with millions of mythic stories for understanding the world we live in. We're still doing it. I don't think there's a bright. This is funny because in an earlier podcast, I was like, well, orthodoxy is in some sense a reaction to Darwin, right? And sort of the division of fantasy from just you can only have fantasy once you've accepted this materialist worldview. And the materialist worldview is something worked out between Newton and Darwin. And you were like, are you saying there's this bright line where like all those things people believed beforehand were sort of all the same thing, and the first people to come up with the new thing are Newton and Darwin? I'm like, no, 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 no. I am saying the opposite of that. I'm saying Newton and Darwin's story is a beautiful story. I love it, and trust me, I think it's extremely useful for predicting recurring patterns in nature. So I will, I I wear a mask because scientists tell me that there's COVID in the air, and I believe them because they have a great track record of predicting repeating patterns in nature.
Right.
But there is a vast gulf from a philosophical point of view between we have this clever way of predicting repeating patterns in nature and saying we have found the truth. Like this is the final story. Like saying, oh, look, our story is because those other previous
Okay, but
patterns stories were also really good at prediction. It's just this one's better. I don't think it's the last one.
So I think there is still, okay. So the kind of framework you're talking about, I want to bring in Diane Duane here. I don't know if you're familiar with her stuff.
No.
Oh, that's a shame. Okay. You should go read all of Diane Duane and then come back and we'll have this conversation.
Okay. Are you going to read Hume, Gadamer, Clifford Geertz?
I read Hume. I went to the University of Chicago, dude. So I had to read all of that stuff. We can read Wittgenstein and then come back. But
You've undoubtedly read more Hume than I have.
Yeah. So I was going to be a philosophy major for a little while. And then literature stole my heart. Also, I had a philosophy professor who was the first philosophy class I took at the University of Chicago was an aesthetics class, and he was one of the world's experts on aesthetics, and he had written the book on it, and so the only book he assigned for the class was his book, and I was so irritated by that I dropped it. So that was the end of my philosophy career. But
I bounced off the Anglo-American philosophical tradition because I thought they were. Anyway.
An amazing philosophy class that was taught by a history professor and a priest, and it was incredible. Co-taught, they did a great job. So going back to Diane Duane, she has written some Star Trek novels. She's written some kids and cats and magic novels.
Okay.
So You Want to Be a Wizard, fabulous. She wrote the Door into Fire series. I would say all of her work tends to have this sort of like C.S. Lewis and the Narnia stuff, has a underlying religious framework that is very similar to the kind of framework you're talking about. And the way she frames it, for example, in one of the Star Trek novels, they break through to another universe because of the new warp drive that they're using. And in that, they find essentially a proto-god and wake him up. It's like an empty universe that has not really started yet. And then...
It's very Magician's Nephew.
And yes, very much Magician's Nephew. So, and then they give him... Sorry, this is kind of giving it away. It's a beautiful, like, the scene makes me cry, right? Like, they wake him up. He's at first angry because it feels like an attack. They work through that. And I say he, but obviously non-gendered. And the proto-god then doesn't want to let them leave because he's lonely. Like, they've taught it consciousness and others. And so, but they make clear to him that they are going to die and they can't stay. And then it learns to let them go. So now this god is actually good. Because
there's a recent Doctor Who episode that had the same
so this was written
anyway, yeah.
So
it probably draws from it, maybe.
Now you have an all-knowing, all-powerful, good proto-god of its own universe.
So just to pause, you realize that the idea of an all-knowing, that's not what you said. It's similar to my, like, you don't.
Hang on.
Okay.
We didn't get to
go on.
Explain
Yeah.
yet. So and then they give it their memories, and then she sets up this system, which is this idea for how it could not be lonely, and that it do this thing where it breaks itself up into many consciousnesses that don't remember that it's a god, that it is they are born and die, and in between those times they can remerge with the godhood and bring everything, etc. Right? So, and this is, I have to say, the only thing that comforted my son when he was 7 or 8 and was dealing with the idea of death. Like, we went through a whole bunch of things, and I feel like, I don't know if this is right, but this is what I kind of hope the universe is like. And and he got on board with that. So
I am very fond of that idea, which is, an idea I learned about. I mean, it's Vedanta, I would say.
Yeah. So but so that's one framework of what she does. And I guess the central piece of it that seems similar to what you're talking about is she talks about different levels of reality. And there's another point where they encounter these beings who are more real than we are, right? They exist in more dimensions. They are a higher order level of reality than we are. And we can only glancingly interact with them. She has that kind of concept come up over and over again. And so when you were talking about, they had a paradigm that was sort of a coherent, complex system, and then we found a new one that was better. To me,
better at predicting repeating patterns in nature.
To me, that seems sort of similar to the kind of work she's doing there in terms of, here's the system, it's a conditional system, and, it works for the moment, but there may be a better, deeper version that we discover. I guess what I'm saying is all of that seems orthogonal to the concept of like a Catholic God, right?
Well, I don't mean
necessarily
what?
Catholic.
Okay, but why do you? I mean, yes,
right? So your higher order systems to me, in some sense, don't feel religious. I guess is really what I'm sort of trying to say. Like,
so that's part. Here's let me pause you for a moment and say my other resistance to the word secular. My other resistance to the word secular is when, as I was saying, Christians think it's all about God. So they have a line where it's like you believe in God, and so from my point of view, my definition of a Christian is you have a Christmas tree and don't feel at all conflicted about it. I mean, that doesn't really cover it because I'm sure there are lots of people who have, you know what I mean? But I mean, I that's a joke. I'm not literally saying that, so don't at me. But I'm in a world which persistently insists that it's secular and reads to me as blazingly Christian. Do you know what I mean? Like when I hear secular, that sounds to me like assimilation into a Christian norm. That's what the word secular, my experience with the word secular, right? So because I think that we're talking about, because the idea that so religion is an interesting piece of culture because it's a piece of culture which is slightly more portable in the sense that you can't really convert to a culture, but you can convert to a religion. It's a bit of culture that a worldview, a philosophical worldview, and not just a philosophical worldview and a whole set of equally, perhaps more important pictures and stories and practices and smells and tastes that has been packaged so that you can actually bring it over. So you can say, oh, you want to be this thing? Like you can't just, it takes it's like I'm sort of Swiss, but there's a way in which I'm not going to be culturally Swiss. And there's not like a clear roadmap of like Rosti, Fastnacht, join a Verein, now you're culturally Swiss. You know what I mean? Whereas religion is sort of like there's nice gateposts and there's like, you believe this, do this, that. Judaism doesn't have much of a believe this, by the way.
Right. I think maybe that's kind of like all we're getting at here. And I don't know that it's important, but like I don't know, like when I was in the Bay Area, I had friends who would define themselves as spiritual, right? And in the sense of they are, they were connected to the spirit of nature, but it had a supernatural quality to it. And I guess I feel like that is a little bit of a bright line. And, if I went to our local Unitarian church and I took my kids every week and we participated in the community and we, sang the songs, did the dances, etc. I don't think they danced, but they should. Then I still would not think I was religious. And
I know. And you're welcome to think what you think. I'm not trying to interfere with your self-definition, but when you say it's a bright line, you should just know it's a really Christian thing to say. I don't mean the Christian like believe in God. I mean like for how it lives for me. Like,
I want to bring in my Hindu friends. Like, I think it might also be a really Hindu thing to say, right?
Maybe, but like supernatural, like, because a lot of religious systems, I feel like the whole idea of the supernatural, like again, that's sort of a before and after. Supernatural is almost a defensive position. Supernatural is something you say if you have already given up on the idea that the way nature works is as God intends. Like if you are living in a system that has not, like, if you, supernatural is a post-Darwin world. It's like, well, I know that there's this mechanistic understanding, and okay, we all agree, blah blah blah, but there's something outside of that, which is God, which is like, that's not what Maimonides would have said. A scholastic, Thomas Aquinas Maimonides, would have said, we need to do science. We need to do a lot of science, because every single thing we find out, science is a piece of the mind of God. There is no distinction there. It's only when religion, Western, particularly Christian religion, has taken a body blow that it even cares about supernatural. You know what I mean?
I have not read Maimonides, so
what's that?
I've not read Maimonides, so now you're venturing into territory that's a little beyond me. But
well, I think it's true of medieval Catholic scholastics too. There's not a.
So let's say there was a.
Well, actually, although I guess I'm not sure I'm right about that.
You're saying that there is a, that science is. You see this with the astronomers, right? Like that this sort of sense of we are discovering the mind of God. Like I get that, but I still think that there is a.
By the way, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the idea that supernatural is a bright line in religion, that being a transcultural constant, is, I think that's what religion starts saying after it's taken this body blow. After it's and now, to be fair, I think actually that Christianity, because it's got this Neoplatonist dualism, Christianity may be much earlier than, say, Judaism and Islam, had the notion that the world was not entirely of God, right? The world is fallen, the world is the body, the world is not heaven. And that's a very Christian, as opposed to, I mean, Christians are definitely far more on that, came up much more took much more from the sort of monastic anti-body dualist side of the early sort of religious ferment in the late Roman Empire. And Jews and Muslims ended up much more on the other side of that, the much more sort of integrative, like the world is God's and all that is in it. Like everything is an expression of God's will. So probably Christianity was seeded earlier to have this distinction between nature on the one hand and God on the other. And it's only, but it's still, I think it's only when you have this extremely coherent competing worldview that says, I can explain how everything happens without any God, that nature starts to take refuge in the supernatural. You know what I mean? I think it's kind of honestly, I think it's kind of a bogus concept. Like, I'm not really sure what supernatural means. What would that, I'm not saying, I don't mean to diss anybody who, I'm saying for me, I'm not saying that I can't coherently understand what someone means by it, but I am kind of trying to decenter it, because there's sort of
if you redefine it every time the system changes to, oh yes, it's all still part of the same system, the system is just bigger than we understood, then there is no supernatural, right? Like,
yeah, and the fact that it's interesting that people balked somewhere along the line, people balked because God, when the best technology for making things was like pottery, people had this image of God as the potter. It's obviously a metaphor. People aren't pots, but God is a pottery, shapes you into what you are. Now, when I'm programming, I can use genetic algorithms. That means I could, if I want to make something, I could be like, oh, well, I'll start with this random seeding, and then I'll like run some things, and then it'll be a thing. So, like, to me, it's perfectly like God, the genetic algorithm designer, is just as natural as God, the potter, right? Like, I don't understand why evolution would be a less interesting tool to use than.
That's still all tools. I still think you're missing like the fundamental. So look, maybe let's try this analogy with parenting. We're both parents, right? I have a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old. you can have the nature versus nurture debate, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I can still kind of look at my child and say, okay, here are some things that are clearly nurture. These are, they're repeating the thing I said 5 minutes ago, right? So I can see where that piece of them came from. Here are things that seem to be nature, like that they have always liked to go, I don't know, take refuge in their room when they're stressed out or whatever. Right. So this is
Parenthetically, and I don't want to get off topic, but I think there's also, like, because I want to quarrel with everything, that binary is also interesting to me because I feel like
sure.
Nature versus environment is a hard line. Nature versus nurture is kind of hilarious because as a parent, I have enough humility to say that it's like, I think it's like maybe 30% nature, 30% nurture. Like there's clearly a lot that is neither. Because there's a lot that is all the rest of the environment that I'm not.
I would put all the rest of the environment in the nurture camp, right? So,
but a lot of it is random. When we talk about nurture, we're often saying like, oh, well, we were nice to them, and therefore, no way. They saw 5 seconds out the window, they saw a red leaf, boom, whole different kid.
Right, but Ben, I don't. You may not include the random in this. I include the random
okay.
in my definition.
Well, anyway, fine.
Right. So
back to your analogy.
So there's the stuff that is biological nature, right? The things that are coming out of electrical impulses in their brain, et cetera, so on, right? So, and there's the stuff that I would say is nurture that's coming from the external world, right? And all of the influences on them, whether parental or otherwise. I still see the supernatural as being different from both of those, right? That a supernatural event would be a disruptive event that would be like my mother asking God to speak to me in my heart and literally change my heart, right? That is outside the system, coming in and rewriting all the rules. That's what I think of as supernatural, and I would like to believe in it. I mean, I write fantasy. I love magic, but to me, so far, I've only been able to encounter it as fiction.
I mean, let's decide whether we want to continue this part of the conversation because you may just find it frustrating. I have a similar sort of argument with Ted Chiang a lot. I don't mean to sound disrespectful when I say that I, honest to God, just think that's an incoherent concept. And I think I'm just coming from a very different place about it, which is if you sort of believe in your heart of hearts that we have arrived at the final truth. Okay, so we've got Newton, we've got Darwin, we've got the latest results from Harvard, and now maybe we need to, refine some things. Maybe we, obviously there's some stuff we don't know yet. We have gray areas here, here, and here, but essentially we know how the universe works. Like we have a set of natural laws, and they're true. Like if you believe that, then you've got that all in a box. If you think of science as that artifact, well, no, I'm not saying you do.
That, right? Like that's not relevant to what I'm arguing.
I think it is. Let me say why I think it is. Let me say why I think it's relevant.
Okay.
If you think science is a process, let me give this example. I was having this conversation with Ted Chiang, who we should get on here to talk about this would be fun, about time travel. And he wrote the brilliant Merchants and the Alchemist's Gate, in which is about a closed causal loop. You can't change what happened. You can't go to the future and change what happened in the past because it's all one system of equations. And he was like, that's actually the only scientifically coherent, logically coherent way to tell a time travel story. Because the Back to the Future thing, where you go to the future and you do something, and then all of a sudden you see the photograph, the other kids disappear from the photograph because they're fading away one by one. He was like, that's completely incoherent logically. And I was like, it's not actually logically incoherent. It's just that it would require a more profound revision to our scientific principles. But if you imagine the day when it happens, also hell has the absence of God is relevant to this. If you imagine the day when it happens, something happens, a thing comes and happens, like God appears and says blah or whatever. If you are a scientist, you do not in that moment knuckle under. You do not say, oh, well, forget it, no system of regular laws. You would then be like, what regular laws would explain this thing? Like there isn't any place that we could place something which science would not be able to extend its reach and try to tell a story about that. Just as there's nothing that we can, because science is a story, a powerful story that operates by certain rules. And so are religions, so are lots of cultural praxes.
Again, I disagree. I would say that C.S. Lewis and and now I'm blanking on her name, and I'm just talking about her. But the woman who wrote the Star Trek novels, etc. Why am I forgetting?
Diane Duane.
Diane Duane, thank you. You haven't even read her. So I would say they are in your system, right? They're making the same argument you're making, which is their experience of God is essentially of a higher order reality.
No,
right?
that's not what I'm saying. I feel like I feel like you keep like I have heard I have patiently listened to hear how you have told me that my system is similar to these Christians. I am not feeling heard. I am saying that there is not a hierarchy of reality. It's not like there's higher order of reality and then lower order of reality. No, I'm saying there's us telling stories. Period. There's just us telling stories. None of the stories are higher or lower. Some stories are more useful for certain things. Some stories we have observed predictably do certain things. There's not any, it's not like, oh, you peel back the mere appearance of science and then there's God. No. Science is protons are a story, God's a story. I have a stuffed animal that I talk to. That's a story. There's only stories.
I don't think I understand what you mean by story in this context then.
What I mean is that we try to make sense of things and then we construct some kind of system. We invent characters or artifacts and then we make up rules and stuff, and it's always us making shit up. It's always us making shit up.
Let me bring in the postmodernists then, because I think maybe this is closer to what you're talking about.
Yes.
Yes. Right. So you have in the 19th century, you have writers who sort of would assume there was an objective truth, and that when you were writing stories, you were trying to represent perhaps that objective truth. And then I think it's often marked with the novel Lord Jim, the start of modernism, but this kind of moment of what if there is no objective truth, right? And then you get the rise of subjectivity, memoirs become popular, we start foregrounding subjectivity, etc. So that shift, to me, this may not be what you're talking about, but that sounds to me like what you're talking about is it is a shift of understanding the universe as being composed of these subjective realities. And,
of our understanding of the universe, at least.
Right. And if you're talking about, say, Derrida or somebody, you're talking about, their fundamental project was saying, like, well, what if we take these stories that are at the center and shift our viewpoint, and we start looking at it from the margins.
Yeah, I'm more of a fan of Gadamer than Derrida. So just to be clear on where I fall on this epistemological arc, I am not asserting that there is no that there is no ultimate reality, nor that there is no reality that we can have anything to do with. But because that's a little farther. That actually seems like an arrogant assertion about ultimate reality to assert that there's no reality, if you know what I mean. Although I think that might be unfair to Derrida. But what I'm actually keen on is Gadamer's notion of the hermeneutic circle, which is to say we don't get to see anything unfiltered. We never get to touch anything outside. We carry our cultural prejudices and our mode of interrogating reality, and that's all we ever get. But it is in contact with something beyond it. It doesn't just evolve sort of randomly. Like you can do it. I don't believe that science is just it's just happenstance that science accurately predicts the universe. I don't think that just happened. We happen to have lucked out so far. I think it is touching on something, but we never get beyond our story about the thing. You know what I mean? One of the reasons I majored in religious science and computer science, religious studies and computer science. One of the reasons I like computer science is that there was this feedback loop. You would have this grand idea of what you wanted to do, and you would code it up, and then harsh reality would tell you, no, that doesn't work, right? You'd have a bug, it would fail, and you'd have to actually look beyond yourself a little and be like, oh, I was wrong. And I feel like that's an important part of the engine of the universe. It's not that we never can get feedback from touching on things, but it's not when I'm writing a program, or even in some feedback loop where I go, I was wrong. I don't arrive at, oh, and now I have the 100% perfect understanding. No, I'm still always just working with my fuzzy mental model.
So I don't know. I'm not sure if we're going to get to like actually talking about the same things, but I'm going to take one more stab. My understanding of what you're saying is I think this notion of like I'm totally with you on we have a fuzzy mental model, we all have our subjective experiences, we are all operating with these filters and these biases and so on and so forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you seem to be postulating that there is a objective truth reality.
Well, there might be. I have no idea. But I think
Okay.
science is the thing that makes me think, the fact that we can get good, not just science, but any, certainly the universe seems to like repeatable patterns. I think you know what I mean? Like that looks okay. So there's a,
Benjamin's willing to postulate or to stipulate that it seems likely that there is an objective reality.
I don't know. Again, I mean, anyway, I'm not claiming there's no objective reality.
Okay. So, and I guess we're in agreement on all of that. Where I see supernatural, religious, spiritual, etc. existing is behind all of that a being, a whateverness that can dissolve it all at a moment's notice, right? And that that exists outside the bounds of the system, right?
Here's what I'm saying. I know that's what it means for you. I know that's how you were brought up. If you insist on asserting that that's what it means, period, you won't understand what it is that I'm doing when I go to synagogue. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
I'm not asserting that's what it means, period.
Yeah, okay.
when I say religion, etc., so on, right? Religion, spirituality, supernatural. That's what I'm referencing as a concept, right?
When I say supernatural is incoherent, what I mean is I don't know. Maybe it's not that it's incoherent. It's like I don't know on some level if something is observable, if it has some effect, then it matters.
I don't think I ever said it didn't matter.
No, I know, but if it doesn't, if we're going to take so what I'm saying is I see the world and I engage in it, and there are stories that are useful, systems that are useful for understanding it. And I don't have this monogamy towards them. Because I don't think that any given system is like the truth. I don't now I think it's a useful game to play. I mean, quantum mechanics and relativity don't match. So it's cool to try to make them match, right? They're contradictory. They can't both be true, right? So if you come up with a grand unified field theory that does everything, that's even better, right? That's cool. But that would still just be a little tiny slice of things. Like there are physicists like Weinberg who think that like once you get it, we just need a couple more dots and then we will know, we will really know everything, we will have it. And that as a science fiction writer, like that just seems like if I said a story 14 million years in the future, I had this experience. I think both Ted Chiang and Patrick Samphire I think gave me the feedback on The House Beyond Your Sky, which is a story set 14 million years in the future, that I originally wrote with an eye to, did some research and used some physics, and there was string theory, and there was this and that. And they were both like, what is the likelihood that 14 million years from now, any of these concepts will be at all, like they'll just seem like they'll seem like physicians using leeches or like the humors, or like all of this stuff is obviously we're just scraping at, right? It'll be vastly different. So you don't necessarily have to think that, but since I don't have a monogamy towards a given worldview, I don't mind having many of them. And I'm not expecting of them that they be final. I'm only expecting of them that they be useful. So, I can pray to God, even though I don't think that even though I'm aware that it is an alternative explanation to the one that I use I'm not even sure it is an alternative explanation, but in any event, it's a different set. That's sort of like I have doubt that I think the individual, like an individual, is kind of a recent invention. I think that our idea of ourself is sort of deeply wrong in a lot of ways. Like we are thinking of ourselves as atomized individuals. And yet I relate to my friends, like I talk to you as if you're an individual. Even though I'm deeply skeptical of the concept on some level, but it's fine because I like you and I want to be able to talk to you, and our cultural framework allows us to talk to each other in this context that we're both individuals. I don't know if any of that makes any sense.
I feel like we've gone far afield at this point.
Okay.
I think you were resisting the word secular being applied to you, and
So I think I'm
I
not secular because I think I'm religious, and what I mean by religious is that I practice religion.
I think definitions of secular, and I think that's okay, right? But when
Sure.
I use the word secular, I don't mean what you mean by it, right? So,
Yeah,
um,
but that's interesting though, isn't it? Like if you're saying if you're using it to describe, what would you mean in describing me as secular? Or would you describe me as
I don't
secular?
know that I would. I don't think I actually said you were a secular
Oh, okay,
humanist. I
fair
think I
enough.
said,
All right.
no,
Um,
you know.
okay, well, I don't know. Anyway, I usually, this is not I often struggle to explain my position on this, and I'm not sure this was successful. But anyway,
Maybe go back to the humanist piece, maybe as we I don't know if we're wrapping up yet, but maybe transitioning to the bit that's relevant to
yeah.
science fiction. At any rate, I think I think I said way back in all of this that I care about people pretty
Mhm.
intensely, um, and I have to admit, I don't care about animals nearly as much. So,
Well, that speaks to
so
my discomfort with humanists. So my discomfort with humanists has to do with the fact that I mean, it's interesting to hear somebody say humanist now because I don't. That I'm more curious about. Secular, I have a more visceral reaction of like I walk through the world feeling like people are using secular to pull a fast one on me. Do you know what I mean? Like I mean, which is funny. It's an odd chip to have on your shoulder, but I honestly feel that there's a way in which I can't quite express how people have a worldview which is ineluctably influenced by the very specific tenets of the Christian church. And the only reason they do is because it was so successful at hegemonically spreading its worldview throughout the world. And so they go like, don't believe in God anymore, but there's still like all these assumptions about what all this stuff means that are totally out of that one specific, very militarily successful tradition. And that's what gets called secular. A. But B, so with humanists,
we really have to revisit this with some
I don't
people
have
from other.
such a strong reaction to humanism like it's threatening to me. It more feels like antique. It sort of sounds like the Renaissance and the Great Chain of Being, like with humans at the top. I sort of feel like, am I a humanist? Like, isn't that giving us a lot of credit? Like, I sort of feel like we're dethroned in a way. Like, humans are interesting and all, but I'm not sure.
So when I say, let's poke at it a little bit in specific, right? So when I say I don't care as much about animals, like I have a dog, I
Mhm.
have cats, I do care about them. My dog is getting older, and we probably will lose her, I would guess, within the next year, and it's going to be horrible and heartbreaking, right? So, um, but I'm not a vegetarian, right? And I used to date one, and she had a hard time dating me because she, I don't know that she would phrase it this way, but it was sort of like, would she date someone who killed babies?
Mhm.
Like she loved me, but there was she loved me despite the fact that I had a deep moral flaw,
Mhm.
right? That I was a bad person in this way, and um, and you know, and there's a bit of um, maybe I'm just lazy. Lazy is not the kind of the right word. Like, but sort of like I don't want to give up my enjoyment of meat, and therefore I don't watch the film on factory farming that might put me in a position where I really had to give up my enjoyment of meat because I couldn't enjoy it anymore, right? And so there's a sort of moral cowardice there in not wanting to face that and enjoying my creature comforts. That's very callous, right? And I think when we talk as science fiction writers about this, I'm thinking of things like Karen Joy Fowler's novel. I'm going to blank on the
Don't
title.
spoiler it.
Okay, yeah.
I know the one you're thinking
So,
of.
all right, well, forget I said anything about it. But, or, well, okay, I don't
Robert
know how to
Reed's
talk.
Market Day is a wonderful story
I
about.
read that Pat Murphy story
Mhm.
on that subject, perhaps. Um, okay, I don't know if we
There are
captured all
lots
this.
of science fiction stories that very well interrogate sort of the.
Yeah, so if you're interrogating, like, to what extent are we going to give animals equal ground in terms of, and this, there's sort of clumsy versions of this, like the David Brin uplift
Yeah,
kind of thing.
yeah,
That was poking at that in
right.
classic science
It's so
fiction,
sad
right?
that I went back to read those, and my memory of them, that's a perfect golden age of science fiction is 12, because the memory of them is so great. But then I was going to give them to my kid, and I went back and read them, and I was like, oh, I don't think I can handle the.
Yeah, I also the first time around, and like even in Pern, I think it's sort of embedded in the genetic engineering of the dragons, right? That they are sentient. So, and
And
I
there's
think
also
that's
science fiction goes to it, I think, fruitfully from both ways, like uplift, and then there's also like Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. There's like stories about, or Blade Runner. There's like stories about, you know, humans. It's dehumanizing. You could subtract from humans or add to animals in order to interrogate that line.
right. And then you can kind of like make a connection, I think, maybe to things like Cory Doctorow and For the Win and so on, where he is looking at how in our world with no science fictional trappings at all, really,
Yeah.
corporations maybe are dehumanizing, or governments are dehumanizing humans and so on. So what was I trying to get to here? I think um,
Your moral qualms about
my moral
humanism
qualms. I guess,
and
well,
vegetarianism.
you know, I guess I would say I'm deeply interested in people. I'm deeply empathic, I think, about human suffering, and less so about animal suffering. I probably care more about the animals depending on how sentient they seem to me. And I think I'm not sure that's a morally defensible position, but I'm just kind of like, on a fundamental level, that's like how I tend to react to the world, right?
Uh-huh.
So, like, if someone were tormenting a monkey, um, that would bother me more than tormenting a turtle,
Are you sure
right?
it's sentience? Consider a rabbit and an octopus. Octopuses are smarter. Let's posit that octopuses are smarter. Does
So
it bother you
I
more?
stopped eating octopus. So yeah, I think
Interesting.
it is the sentience, right? Like I can't, I've got a cookbook coming out. I cook all kinds of things. I cook squid, but and a kanamai curry is so good.
Uh-huh.
It's so delicious. It is a very specific flavor. And I have not yet really interrogated, like, what is the squid that I'm eating?
Yeah.
How
How
does
smart?
it
Where
compare
is
to
it on the
octopus?
great chain of being?
Yeah, but I kind of need to at some point because I can't go into an Italian restaurant and order octopus anymore. And I have in the past, but I'm just done,
Do you
right?
want me
Like,
to
and
respond on
go ahead.
this? So,
So respond to any of this.
so I don't know. So here's my thing. I there's I'm not a partisan for either emotion or logic. I think a well-ordered human brain balances both. You know what I mean? But I think that it's useful to there's the estrangement of logic is useful to interrogate emotion, and emotion is also useful as a reality check on logic, right? So there's a way in which I like furry animals better than scaly animals. I feel connected to them more. They're sweet and cute. And that's a feeling. And I'm not renouncing that feeling, but I also am not going to like erect it on a pillar as like, pledge my fealty to it as an intellectual principle. And in a
Right.
similar way, I'm not really very close to any non-human animals. I don't have any pets. We had rats. They were really cool, but then the rats died and my kids were kind of traumatized. They were like, no more pets, they die. So then we haven't had pets since then. So I'm very distant from any non-human animals. It's not that I have like a personal connection to a horse where I'm like, that horse is making me stop. My love for this horse is keeping me from declaring myself a humanist, But
Right.
I like humans because they're like me. But I'm acutely aware that that isn't like what I want to necessarily hang my flag on. You know what I mean? when I grew up in the Cold War, and I was very like terrified as a kid because I lived in Washington D.C. The Russians were going to bomb us, and there was this terribly inhuman thing of being in this situation where it was like, we might have this all obliterating war. We were constantly being told that the nuclear Armageddon clock was 5 minutes away, and I remember going to summer camp when I was 9 years old and being like, this is outside the blast radius. We would die of like radiation poisoning. Not we would not be we would not be incinerated. Like, you know what I mean? So, but and I think at the time, if you'd asked me like, we've got to choose us or the Russians, I would have been like, well, us. But I wouldn't consider that a moral choice. You know what I mean? I wouldn't consider that like so on the same level. Like I mean, I actually am a vegetarian, and we don't drink much milk. We eat eggs. You know what I mean? We're not like super vegan, but it's certainly for both animal handling reasons and also environmental reasons. We're sort of veganish, but
Mm-hmm.
but on the other hand, I am like totally fine if they test, to have a COVID vaccine, like they're going to inject it into monkeys. If it's another
Yeah,
year, if we could say don't test it on, I'm against animal testing for like cosmetics, but if it's like, well, it's going to take another year to get a vaccine if we have to use,
right.
these models or sacrifice a whole lot of patients, it's like, yeah, obviously I'm going to choose a human over a monkey.
But there's an interesting question about sort of right now. I think like the ethics of human trials too, right? Like
Yeah,
um, after after Tuskegee, et cetera,
right.
there's huge pushback on using humans as tests in these things, but that's kind of rubber meeting the road right now, where if
Well,
the
and
consequences are high enough, and if it used to be, I mean, I think I'd have to check this with my sisters who are doctors, but I think you weren't even allowed to volunteer as a
mhm,
test subject, right?
yeah, yeah,
And now I think we've hit a point
yeah.
where they're like, maybe we're going to allow
Yeah, I
volunteers,
think a
right?
lot of things are loosening up in the pandemic, but also there were headlines about people being like, "Oh, well, we'll test this in Africa." Like, obviously, the spirit of Tuskegee is alive and well. There was a, well, we'll donate this thing and it's experimental, but then there's sort of like, on the one hand, it might save lives. On the other hand, you're
Yeah.
picking the cheaper lives to try it on first. I mean, and that's the spirit of
Stephen Barnes' story. I just want to
uh-huh.
the woman in the wall. I think is the title of it. It's in Dark Matter about an American who goes to Africa and a black woman
Hmm.
and ends up in a camp that is essentially a incubation center for a disease.
Yeah, yeah,
It's horrific, and it's about her feeling of like, well, I'm American. Like
right.
this is not supposed to be in a place like this. So
So
anyway,
so
just
I
like
have this feeling like, sure, like I don't consider myself super morally coherent in the sense that if I was some hardcore vegan, I'd be like, let's not have a vaccine and not torture monkeys. But I'm like, if it's bad enough, go ahead and torture the monkeys. But I don't know that that state sentiment is going to age well. I don't know that people listening to this, unearthing this podcast in 50 years are, you know what I mean? Like that, like for me to say, oh, I'm going to choose a human over a monkey, that statement may not age any better than, some of these other things, because on some
there's
fundamental level, go ahead.
yeah. There's a Star Trek novel that interrogates that, and I'm trying to remember. I don't know that I can remember which one, but it's they're looking at callousness,
Hmm.
and the argument that they're sort of making is that when humans, I think it's the Prometheus design, is the novel, that when humans let themselves do things like testing on even for medical reasons, testing on animals, it injures us, right? That even if we think, well, this is expedient for the greater good, etc., that the process of doing that does us, in some sense, greater harm. I don't know that I can buy into that, but
I mean, also A and B. I mean, that's interesting, but also that's still rooting it in humans. Like, if it turned out it was okay for humans to torture animals, then that'd be fine. Like, do you know what I mean? It's like that still is explaining it in terms of like, oh well, it turns out at the end of the day it's bad for humans. I mean, I think that
it's bad for the universe. I don't know. It was a I don't know. I'd have to go back and reread the
I
passage.
guess I feel. I mean, I guess I feel like, yeah. There's also a whole lot of trolley problem ethical arguments here about the greatest for the greatest number, a theme Star Trek is fond of expanding on. But
Yeah.
but the I guess what I'm saying is my discomfort with the word humanist is, sure, at the end of the day, I'm going to root for humans. But I think honestly, I'm just rooting for my team. Like, I don't think there's any particular moral. I'm uneasy with elevating that to some kind of grand moral principle because I don't actually think that humans are all that special. Like, I think that humans are neat and that
Mm-hmm.
many things about human culture are worth preserving, also dangerous. But I ultimately think that the line between humans and other living things is not a bright one.
There's a difference between what you might do, what you think you probably would do, and what you think you ought to do,
Yeah,
right? And
right.
so, right, so like, if we were, I remember when there was some conflict in the Middle East, and I actually don't remember which one this was, but I ended up writing a poem about the fact that if it came down to it, I was willing, I think, to like, kill someone in another country to save my husband, right?
Hmm.
Like
Right.
there's, right? So that's, it is, and it with
And
no moral justification, right? But I think there's a difference between that and like, I can imagine writing a science fiction story in which we encounter, say, humans go out there and encounter another species, and a protagonist who says, like, well, this species is just better than we are, like, for whatever reason, right? And they deserve to live more or whatever else. And like, I don't know, like, I don't know that I could do it as an individual, but I want to believe that someone might make that choice. Does that make sense?
no, yeah, oh, it does. But I'm sort of like I think I also want to take a stand against the notion of like that there's something even theoretic like I even theoretically in the widest reach of the thought experiment that there's like an entity that deserves to live more
Yeah,
than
I don't know
another
what the
entity, really.
yeah,
You know what I mean? Like because I
yeah,
mean and that is actually some of the like I am uneasy with the I think it's not so bad not to be on some level. I mean, these are two things that need to be tempered against each other because I don't want to say, my team first, let's kill everybody else and take their stuff. But on the other hand, I
right.
think that expecting of ourselves um, to be abstractions, to be like, well, my husband's life is no more than this other person I've never met. Oh, I'll flip a coin to see who of them lives or dies. I think that's kind of monstrous. Like I don't think we're meant to be disembodied intellects ruling according to abstract principles. I think we're meant to be messy. I actually think that we are animals, and it's totally fine for us to be. I think we should be as gentle and caring as possible to all sentiences, all living things, all things, and like it's okay that you love your husband more than an abstract person you've never met. Like that is let us not
I think
expect of ourselves to be
right? Like,
engines of abstraction, right? But
well, so when you say okay, right? I mean, I think it's understandable. I think it is the way people are. I
I think it's
I
more than
don't know
understandable. I think if I was enjoining people how to live, I would not necessarily. I do not think that you should kill. I mean, do you know what I mean? I'm not. That way lies both
right? Like,
ways lie madness, right? Both. There's a lot of these things where it's like the truth is balanced on the edge of the blade. Like both ways. Like it is. Like if you any logical philosophy that you follow to its absolute ultimate conclusion rigidly is going to be monstrous. You know?
I mean, when you're faced with a monstrous choice, I mean, like, this is the trolley problem thing, right? Like, if let's say I see somebody drowning and I hope I risk my life to try to save them, right?
Yeah.
I hope I'm that kind of person.
Right.
So, what if there's 5 people drowning and I know that I'm going to die in the process, but I'll save them? I hope I do that too, right? And that's a pure kind of like numbers game, which is a little ridiculous, but it is what it is. If I see 5 children drowning and I have to sacrifice my child to save them, the the moral logic, I don't know if it changes. It gets much harder to do personally, right?
But
But
I mean, I'm interested in the moral logic question. Obviously, it's harder to do personally. I mean, I think we could take that as read. But I am interested in the question: Do we want people to be? Do we want people to aspire to sacrifice their own child in a heartbeat for 2 other people? Do we think that would be a better world to live in? Would we like to live in a society where everyone was like, oh, it's 2 children? Fine, take my child's organs. I mean, that's one of the variants of the trolley problem, right? Is it's like, we could save these 5 sick people if we just cut up this one perfectly healthy person. Like, do we want to live in a world where people are like, oh, my child's organs but you could use to save these other 10 children? Well, sorry, honey. Like, I
Yeah,
don't actually I actually think I like living in a world where people are, messy and wet and made of flesh and like love the things they love. I don't want them to pursue that selfishly and greedily and murder others out of to avoid the tiny possibility. Like, we live in a world actually where we're bombing the shit out of people to avoid some kind of pretended imaginary possible threat to our own. Right? So we're pretty far away from any kind of world in which we're abstractly sacrificing for the ultimate good. So we should move in the direction of selflessness, don't get me wrong. But I'm not sure that it's optimal to, in a purely ideal sense, to be to reduce ethics to mathematics. You know what I mean? I think it's okay for us to be, and that's actually part of the the reason I think we're animals. You know what I mean? Like, I was like, the reason I wanted to solve this distinction between, or why I'm uncomfortable with this distinction between us as these higher beings who express philosophical principle. I don't know. I think sometimes we just cuddle the warm, fuzzy people near
So
us.
what if we're not? I mean, you keep coming back to like animals, right? I mean, I'm not sure I understand what you mean in that sense of. I really am much more of a bright line person than you are. I think it's part of this.
I feel like that's going to be a theme of this podcast. I hope it's not frustrating to you. You will perennially introduce dichotomies, and I will try to
It's okay. It's okay if
complicate.
you are immoral and terrible, but that's fine.
I'm terrible.
I can love you anyway, even if you're a bad person, right? So,
That's good.
but the like take the fleshy bit out of it for just a second, like bracket it. Let's say we have robot sentience, right?
Sure.
So they're not fleshy anymore. Whatever.
Well, when I say fleshy, I actually think that applies to
Right.
robots. I mean,
I'm
I'm using it as a metaphor.
You don't really mean fleshy, right? So mostly I wanted to bring that up to clarify.
Yeah, no, actually, and yeah, go ahead. I have thoughts on robots too, but go on, because that's another place we should go in this podcast about the what is human.
Right. I think. Well, but so I don't know. I think I still obviously every day we are making these decisions that say do not take my kidneys just because they will save other people's, right? Like there's a certain bodily autonomy thing. I'm pro-choice. I don't think I should be forced to bear a child, etc. Right? So, we're always kind of balancing rights against each other, and it's not, and goodnesses against each other, and it's not a clear cut. Here is one thing that is good is saving more lives, and
the world is actually not full of trolley problems. That's one very important truth of philosophy. Is the world is, you know what I mean? Because
I would disagree. I'd say the world is full of trolley problems, but they are modified by things that are not pure numbers, right?
Well, I guess what I mean is the world is not. First of all, the world. The sketchy thing about the problem is that if you're doing the trolley problem, you say, "Oh, I figured out a way to save them all." Then the person says, "No, no, 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 that's not the trolley problem." Like, so the trolley problem discourages you from considering third alternatives. Anyway, go on.
No, but I want to connect that to 2 science fiction things. So that's like Captain Kirk and the Kobayashi Maru test, right? Where the whole point of the test was to teach starship captains that sometimes they can't do anything to save their people. And Kirk, being Kirk, rewrites the test every time and tricks the test. And we cheer for him, but I think it's sort of interesting what Star Trek does with that because it sets up Kirk as a hero for beating the test, and yet later in the series, it kind of comes home to him. They're like, well, you never learned the lesson of the Kobayashi Maru, and Star Trek comes and says, like, you can't always rewrite the test to avoid the issue. And that I want to connect to the cold equations, which I have really mixed feelings about this story. So this classic science fiction story about there's a girl who stows away on a ship and there isn't enough fuel, and so they end up the pilot and the engineer like they have to face the cold equation.
I think there's only one. Are they both aboard? There's only one person?
I think there's 2 men on the ship and the stowaway girl, if I'm remembering right. I read it a long time ago. I could be wrong. But however, they explained to her that like the cold equations of space are that they have to space her or else everybody dies, right? And there's been a real pushback to that story in recent years, and people saying like this is a very sexist story, and it is set up to kind of say that there's, like the system is the system and it's like a capitalist economy and whatever. And can't we, like the story is clearly set up to make a pedagogical point, and, maybe a more feminist version of this would have them coming up with some Captain Kirky way to rejigger the system, rethink everything. And I want to support that, yes. And at the same time, I also still kind of believe in the cold equations at the heart of everything.
Sure. I mean, yes. But I think when I say the world is not actually full of trolley problems, what I mean several critiques. One is that you rarely have perfect certainty. So Noah's super logical. And when I first learned about the trolley problem, he was appalled at the notion that anyone would even hesitate to sacrifice the one person to save the five people, because it was so evidently clear to him that that was a terrible idea. And I had to explain I had to sort of like explain why. And what I did was I said, if you look at this on a meta level, not like what do you think is right, but like what do you think people should think is right? Can you see why it would be advantageous for a society to have certain principles like do not murder the innocent, even if you think you're doing the right thing? If you have perfect information, then of course that's silly. But in fact, we don't have perfect information. So everyone who thinks they're in a situation that's a trolley problem does not actually 100% know that murder, because people in war are often, because that's like, I don't know, the Bush administration in 9/11 is like, we need to do these terrifying, horrifying things because we are 100% sure that will avoid this greater evil, right? Like 24 ticking bomb, torture the terrorist. It's like, yeah, but you don't, right? Like, so if you have certain inviolable principles that are like, we have these inalienable human rights and we do not violate them, even if our equations tell us that it's going to be the greater good for the greater number for us to violate these things, those strictures, those principles, those inviolable things are there as guardrails because we think we know more than we do, right? Partly.
Yeah.
If you simply, if you allow because that's what I mean also about your reasoning will lead to atrocity. Your perfectly logical reasoning will lead you to atrocity, right? Because you've run the numbers, and clearly, for the glorious socialist revolution, we need to let the Ukraine starve. Their sacrifice will be justified by the brighter future for humanity. But like, some little voice in your head is appalled at that, and if you suppress that as your animal nature, which simply squeamishly rebels against the truth that you have to follow through, you have eliminated a guard against your own ignorance, right? That sort of, oh my God, what the fuck am I doing? Like, more people should be, people who decided not to launch the missiles during the Cold War, even though it seemed logically evident that they were listening to that voice that was like, wait a minute, what the fuck? Which is not a voice that, it's not the voice. Yeah.
Right? Like the math version of this, and I think this is the argument people make against the cold equations, is that the writer had reduced it to a much simpler system than it would actually be, and that the tendency to do that gets in the way of our understanding greater complexities and possibly more compassionate solutions, etc. And I think you see that. I see that right now in the American healthcare debate all the time, right? I see people who will sort of like throw out a bunch of plausible sounding math about why we can't possibly afford universal healthcare. And they don't realize that their plausible sounding math is based on a set of assumptions that are invisible to them. And there's so yes.
So I guess to sum up, what I was saying is the world does contain trolley problems, but the actual trolley problems are outnumbered by the things that people are presenting to you as trolley problems. Like, people are presenting them to you as, you have to sacrifice these people you have to sacrifice this good for this good. But most of the time, you know what I mean? The incentive to present things as like, well, we know the situation, and these, so you should be skeptical of the assertion that when I say the world's not full of trolley problems, it's not that they don't exist, but you should be skeptical because people have an enormous incentive to present things as like binary, choices where someone loses. Anyway.
Right. Yes. Okay. So do we want to say anything? We've been going for a while. Do
On
you want to say
humanism.
something about robots before we go?
Well,
Or
what I was going to say about robots. So, well, let me segue us out of trolley problems. And just I have one point to make about robots, but sort of we've been talking a lot about lives, like lives saved. And one thing that strikes me when you're like, would I jump into the pool to save the 5 children, even if I knew I was going to drown, is that like I don't know if I would or not. I would hope I would, but honestly, if I would, I think it would have less to do with some kind of numeric equation of like those 5 lives are worth 5 times as much as my 1 life, and more like I am living this story of me as a person, and this is how do I want it to end? And if I was like, you know what, I do not want to be the kind of person who walked away from the 5 drowning children. I want to be the kind of person who dove in to save the 5 drowning children, and my loyalty to that narrative of self is greater than my loyalty to like the heart continuing to pump the blood through the tissue, right? Because there's 2 Benjamin Rosenbaums. One is this sort of accumulation of tissues and stuff, and then that generates this other Benjamin Rosenbaum, which is like, what would Benjamin Rosenbaum do, right?
sure.
And they are interact. Neither is primary or secondary. They're like there's a feedback loop, right? Great story, by the way, on the subject of like identity and like our individuals real is Second Person Present Tense by Daryl Gregory. Have you read that? One of my favorite science fiction
I'm not
stories of
sure.
this century. It's pretty great. Anyway,
Yeah.
so but
Sorry, I have to pause to let my dog out. One sec. Speaking of
no
animals.
worries. I assume we'll cut this part out, perhaps.
Oh, yeah, it's sort of relevant, right? So,
Let the dog out. Yes, it is relevant. But robots. So on some level, what we care about is
wait,
not just the brute. Hmm?
hang on. Before you go on,
Hmm.
I agree with everything you just said,
Hmm.
but I also want to say the numbers still carry a weight for
Sure.
me. And
Oh no.
I
Yeah.
think like, for an example, like, would I drown myself to save 1 person versus 2 versus 10 versus 10,000? I feel like it gets easier
Hmm.
to make the self-sacrificing move when there's large numbers on
Sure.
the other
Oh,
side.
I'm not
Right?
saying that. I'm not saying the math doesn't matter at all, or that the numbers don't matter at all. I'm just saying I don't actually think that I'm this abstract moral entity that is like 5 lives, 1 life, like irregardless of
Yeah.
whose lives they are. I don't expect of myself that that's how. I don't expect of myself that I would be like these 5 lives are worth more than my 1 life. I don't think so. But I expect of myself perhaps that I would be like I do not want to be the person who did not save these 5 people at the risk of their own
And
life.
in fact, there have been a couple situations in my life where there was perceived danger to somebody else, and what I actually found myself doing in that situation was interposing. Like, I did put myself on the line
Hmm.
and put myself at risk. There was no conscious choice involved.
Yeah.
I mean, like, that's
Yeah.
another thing I kind of want to highlight here, right? Like, there was one situation, for example, I was walking with my boyfriend. There was it through a dark underpass in Chicagoland, and there was an older woman ahead, and this guy came up and started hassling her. And like a second later, I was there between the 2 of them, putting my body there, talking to her, etc. And my boyfriend was a few steps behind, like, but it wasn't like there was no moral decision
Right.
making. It's not that I was a better person than him
Right.
or anything like that, right? It was just like I have a fundamental instinctive protective reaction, whatever, that like leads me to do
Well,
that,
and
right?
that is actually yet another thing that I sort of mean by the world is not full of trolley problems is we spend lots of time, if particularly for a certain sort of person, like talking about these sort of grand philosophical. What if it was absolutely certain that you would? Well, the fact is, it's not going. Luckily, you will never be in a situation where you are like, I could absolutely save these 5 children, and I will absolutely die. No, in fact, what you're always talking about is risk and impulse, and in fact, I have far more trust in my faculties of spontaneous emotional, like if like I am very skeptical of my like logical reasoning about like, well, am I more of a utilitarian or am I more of a Kantian, while they're drowning. Like I have much more trust in my spontaneous ability to like assess what is the next right action, not like this mathematical which of these is the better outcome, but which is the next right action.
Well, I do agree, and I think I do have more trust in that. And yet, at the same time, I very clearly cannot trust myself on all the things that are like like avoiding factory farming, or only
Sure.
buying chocolate that doesn't involve child slaves, etc. Like those
Right.
things require a conscious analysis and awareness of the issues, and then a decision to sacrifice for.
Well,
I mean,
but here's the
you know,
interesting thing. Here's the interesting thing. I think the root, so I'm not saying the intellect is of no use in moral reasoning. I don't think moral reasoning is no use. But I think actually that we skip a step because, I do avoid those things. And the reason I avoid those things is not because my moral reasoning is different or my character is greater, but because of my habits. Like, you know what I mean? Like, in fact, the route by which like what's actually going to happen in some situation, whether it's children drowning in a stream like, or whether it's like, you just picking something up, half thinking in the line at the grocery store that you're not really even fully conscious what ends up in your cart. Like in both of those situations, it's not your conscious moral reasoning that's going to be in the driver's seat. What's going to be in the driver's seat is your reactive, instinctive, how you spend most of your day is in the mode of like, and indeed need to, because there's no cognitive way to morally reasoning about everything that goes on. But and your moral reasoning doesn't have direct access to that sort of pre-conscious decision making. What it does have access to is like setting up structures that produce habits, right?
yeah, yeah,
Like habits are character is the accumulation, is the result of habits, right? I mean, like on a very, and that's a very um and that goes into this.
Benjamin Franklin.
Oh yeah, interesting.
Oh, you can see this in his biography.
Yeah.
There's a bit. I love this bit. There's a chart where
Uh-huh.
for a week he decided that being a more moral person
Yeah.
was basically well, and so he
Uh-huh.
said like I want to be more temperate. I want to not be a glutton, whatever it is.
Right,
Like
right.
he had a list of 7 things, and then every day he consciously worked on it and checked it off and made it a habit.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah,
With the goal at the end of 2 months, I'm going to be a much better person.
yeah.
And the funny bit is the last thing he was going to work on was humility. And he got to the end, and all this is, well, this experiment, I did really very well on everything except humility. And given that I did very well on everything,
I guess I don't need so much humility. Yeah, that's funny. It's interesting, the historical, like such historical movements. There's also like, there's that. I think that's interesting. That's sort of very early, like people like things that we would think of as pop psychology now, but like their early roots, like Wesleyans and Quakers, and also like there was a Musar movement in the Lithuanian. We're very familiar with the sort of southern shtetl culture that's like the Hasidim with their black hats and their ear curls and they're chanting and they're praying and dancing and whatever. There were these guys up in Lithuania who were super like dour. They're like the Quakers of or the Puritans of Judaism. And they were very like, they would do these moral inventories. Like the whole thing was like, you'd spend all this time. They were not super like praying and ecstatic and mystical. They were all about like all the things you did today and like, reviewing them and going over like, I don't know, but not necessarily in a repenting way, but like in an optimizing way, like sort of like very, very much in that Benjamin Franklin vein. Anyway, humans. I was going to make a segue to robots. So what I was going to say is, so it's not just necessarily about bodies and numbers, it's about principles. Also, like, sometimes you go and rush into the burning synagogue to save a Torah because culture or meaning is, you're willing to sacrifice, you're willing to risk physical life for like things that are of symbolic meaning, right? Like there's a we are more than just beating hearts, right? And our cultures matter, our integrity matters, our story matters. And along those lines, like, so there was this trend, which may have already peaked probably, about science fiction dealing with the post-human, like following on from Werner Vinge and the singularity, and maybe there'll be these post-human things that we create, or maybe we'll become these post-human things, we'll modify ourselves, and we like accelerate on an exponential curve beyond the line of the human, and then we're not human anymore, and it's unimaginable, right? I'm very interested in that space and have written a lot of stories playing around with that. But my take on that is nobody ever is going to say I'm post-human. I mean, maybe some hipsters, you know what I mean? Maybe like, oh, we're post-humans, but no. But I mean, like, whatever you are, you consider to be human. So our descendants, thousands of years in the future, who have different bodies and different substrates that they run on, whatever, they're very likely to.
an interesting question, and maybe this is a good place to pause and pick up, right? Is there anything that we could transform into, like you and I have talked about upload before, right? And if we become completely disembodied, are we still human, or is this now like is this a new thing?
Well, this is
Do you know what I'm saying?
precisely what I'm saying. What precisely I'm saying is when we ask this question, like, so me and Corey Doctorow wrote this story where the characters are a fractal series of sentiences inside sentiences that end up being these sort of giant um, uh, things that like come and munch up asteroids and turn them into pure computronium. And there's like essentially two of them fighting in a kind of Cold War for the fate of the universe. They're very far from like us kind of humans. But
Right.
but but we always ask the question, like us here now, looking into the future at this strangeness, going like, is that human? But of course, that's not what's going to happen. We're going to be in there in the strangeness, right? And then of course we're gonna, and then I won't say of course. I won't say of course. Here,
I mean, what class? Because you used to, I don't know if your opinion has changed on this. Like, you used to say maybe a decade ago that you wouldn't want to be uploaded because the body was so central to your experience of what it meant to be you, right?
it always depends on. I mean, like, do I want to be uploaded? I don't even want to be on Twitter. I mean, I do want to be on Twitter, but you know what I mean. Like, like,
Yeah.
do I? What's the alternative to being uploaded? If the alternative is death, I think I'd give it a shot. And B, like, what uploaded? Like, I love Jim Monroe's book, Everyone in Silico, and I think I haven't seen it yet, but I think there's a show out now that's sort of similar. But it was many years ago. It was a great book, and it's sort of like the uploading where it was this very hilarious, funny, and clever take on the uploading that we're actually going to get. Not the sort of, at the time, everyone was positing this sort of abstract, Starfleet kind of like utopian uploading. And he was like, no, this is like branded corporate uploading where you know what I mean? Like you upload yourself, you pay by an installment plan, and you get the gold plan gives you different privileges than the silver plan. Like what uploading are you offering me? I do think that the body and being embodied is ineluctable. And I think that the only way you can but the body, what does the body mean? It doesn't mean flesh. There's nothing you know what I mean? I think that we vastly underestimate our embodiedness. And a lot of my stories are sort of like, it's very difficult to jump from one substrate to another. Is not a matter of just encoding the data and you know what I mean? Like I think that to the extent that we already see this now, right? So in the 60s, we were really into artificial intelligence, and we were like, we're going to build machines to like figure stuff out, right? And the way they would figure stuff out is they would have these if-then trees, and we would code them up so we would know what was in there. We would know all the coding. And then we said, these will solve hard problems like chess. Chess is a hard problem or something like that, right? So it turned out that those kind of problems were relatively easy. Like stacking blocks is actually quite hard. Like a robot arm looking at things and stacking blocks is quite hard. Like chess, not as hard, or checkers, or whatever. But even
Mm-hmm.
chess, we needed to go beyond the way they thought they would do it. The way we thought we would do it would be by understanding the process and then building some kind of logical tree that would do it. And then we would know. The nice thing about this is not only have we built a computer that did the thing, we would also know what it meant to do that thing. And the funny thing, and this is like many Pyrrhic victories in technology, is what we have now is we have robots that can do things that are much harder than that, like read your handwriting or translate from one language to another. But the hilarious punchline is that the only way we were able to build such things is by giving up on knowing what they did. Because
Mm-hmm.
the Google Translate, nobody at Google understands how it works.
Really? So this
No,
is
because
outside of my.
because it's emergent. Because the way you actually end up building such things, one way or another. I mean, there's lots of math and stuff here that I'm not saying they don't know how they were. In some sense, they built it, but it's highly contingent. It's essentially embodied. It's like if you ran it on different test data, you'd get different results. And you can't look at if you have something like essentially that's like a neural net. It's like a model of a brain. When you want to do something hard, when you do something easy, you can do if-then stuff. But if you want to do something
Mm-hmm.
hard, you train it the way you train a human. You show it all kinds of patterns, and it makes all kinds of associations, and then it decides all kinds of crazy things. There's all these this artificial intelligence, deep learning, machine learning stuff is sort of very smart and very dumb, just like humans are. It'll be like it'll be very good at predicting, who's gonna win this baseball tournament, but you realize that it's going by the color of the jersey. because it turns out that correlates. You know what I mean? And nobody knew that. They just ran it on the test data. So there's this way in which if the body is what is beyond our understanding, what is beyond our control, the thing that we are part of, that we are in and part of, but are subject to, and that doesn't simply correspond to our will, then there's no uploading where you lose the body. You know what I mean? The body is just a different, you could be.
Well, this is where, I want to wrap it around. Okay, yeah. I'm going to say three things. One is I'm very tempted to wrap this around to, well, the body then is just like our scientific and religious structures from earlier, as opposed to an upload where you didn't have to worry about the body in some sense, closer to my idea of what magic or a Christian God is like, right? But
wait, I'm not sure I understand the analogy. I kind of want to.
That you're saying that the body is like this system that has rules and structures which we may or may not understand, but they're there, and even if we upload, we're still tied to those, and they exist. And I'm like, all of that seems like science to me, as opposed, this is like science and science fiction is that realm, and magic is the realm of, no, there is some fundamentally different thing that is beyond the, where you might no longer need to be tied to any form of the body anymore, or anyway. So I feel like that's going to be a long thing.
I think we should try again on religion and free will and so on, and maybe we should get Ted Chiang as a guest or something.
I'm saying three things. So that was one thing, which we may or may not come back to. Two, I am reminded of the question of why are plays and movies typically 2 hours, because of the capacity of the human bladder. And that's why, right? And so. And I am being reminded of that because I've been drinking water all through this podcast. We run now 2.5 hours
embodied.
So we are embodied, limited by that sort of
thing. Thank goodness.
And well, yeah, maybe thank goodness. We were like, will they shut up? So, and three, as we are wrapping up, I'm going to make us wrap up, because when we think about like ethical abuses and how we make these choices and habituate and so on, one of them is that we have a wonderful sound engineer, Darius, who was told it would be a 2-hour recording, and we are now 2.5 hours.
Oh, no.
And we should,
that's not good. We lose track of the time, which probably means that I am also late. So, okay.
Yes. So let's wrap up. There are a few texts that I wanted to mention.
I'm quite late. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm going to say, if you're interested in the human-robot questions, 2 things I've read in the last year that I loved on this were Annalee Newitz's novel Autonomous and Martha Wells' series about the Murderbot Diaries. The first one is All Systems Red. It's a series of novellas, and if you read those 2, we should come back and talk about them. Excellent.
In conclusion, Mohenraj and Rosenbaum are humans.
We still think we're humans.
The last thing I was going to say is that I think humanity is a tradition, really, and that those things in the future that we are saying, wow, they're so weird, they're post-human, whether they are humans or not is going to depend on whether they think they are part of a tradition of humanity, ultimately.
Nice. I like that, and that connects it right back to Judaism and religion.
Indeed.
So, all
right, more later. Bye.
Bye.